Today, we will learn how to make a Lambda function, give it permissions, add libraries to our Lambda function, as this can give some people errors if you don't know how to do this, learn how to code a Lambda function in Node.js, and configure a test event for this Lambda function. We will make a function where when it gets past a certain path with path parameters and query string parameters, we get a response based on these parameters. Let's get started. We will make a new folder and open it in VS Code. So we are going to write this function in Visual Studio Code because when you need an external library, you cannot import it through AWS Lambda. So we are going to write this function in Visual Studio Code because when you need an external library, you cannot import it through the online editor in AWS. So we will write npm install moment. This library provides functions for common date and time operations. Let's write const moment equals require moment to import that library. Next, we write our exports handler function. There are a couple things to explain about this function. The heart of every Lambda function is the exports.handler function. This is where AWS invokes your code. Exports.handler equals async event. This line exports an asynchronous function named handler. AWS Lambda identifies this function as the entry point when your Lambda function is called. Guys, remember, in essence, typically synchronous execution means that things can get executed one after another in the way it is written, and asynchronous execution is when things are not executed in order. So this async function basically only gets called when the event happens. The event object encapsulates details about the event that triggered the Lambda function. You see, guys, in Lambda, a lot of different services can use Lambda to execute some code on a certain event, such as AWS S3, AWS API Gateway, DynamoDB, etc. There are a lot of services that can call a Lambda function, and when the service tries to call the Lambda function, it passes some information about the event that can be used within the Lambda function. The easiest way I can show this is by showing the templates for different test events. All of these things can be passed into a Lambda function, so we can manipulate a lot of things. For HTTP-based triggers like API Gateway, this includes HTTP request details such as headers, path parameters, query parameters, and more. Let's move on to the logic of this Lambda function. It is very simple. When the user visits our web page, they will pass in their name and the language they wish to use on this website. This information will be passed through a URL, through path and query parameters. We will be sent this information to our Lambda function and use it to craft a tailor-made response. Let's make an array of our different greetings. Next, let's get the visitor name that is passed into our Lambda function. Notice we use the event object to get this information, which tells us that the service which called this function gave us this information. Next, let's get the language they wish to use from the visitor. Next, this is our logic to determine what response to send. This line constructs a message variable that dynamically selects a greeting based on the lang parameter. If lang is provided and matches a language key in the greeting object, it uses that specific greeting. If lang is not provided or does not match, it defaults to English. Then it appends the name parameter to the end of the greeting message, creating a personalized message based on the input parameters. Next, let's wrap all our response info into one object like this, containing our message and timestamp we get using the moment library. Remember guys, this function gets triggered off an HTTP request. Therefore, we must return an HTTP response. Return status code 200 body JSON stringify response constructs an HTTP response with a status code of 200 indicating success and a JSON encoded body containing the response object. This structured response format ensures compatibility with API Gateway's expectations when used as a proxy integration. Guys, also if you are confused by the word proxy, all it means is in API Gateway, the request passed with no sort of transformation or parsing to it. We can do some validation of the requests so that they are in a particular format, but proxy says we do not do any transformation of the request and pass it to the Lambda function as is. Now we zip this up and head over to AWS to upload it and see it working. And head over to AWS to upload it and see it working. Let's make a Lambda function call. Let's call this function greet3. Select the node.js.20x runtime. Keep the rest of the settings as default. Let's upload our function. We see our exact same function. Now, the last thing we will do is configure a test event simulating our function being called. We use the API. We see our exact same function. Now, the last thing we will do is configure a test event simulating our function being called. We use the AWS API proxy template. Our path parameter is called name, so we must make that kind of key value pair in our test event. We put the name and the value can be Joe. Then we put in a path parameter representing our name and a query parameter representing the language of the visitor wishes to see. The language can be Spanish. Let's name the test test1 and save it. Let us run it. We get a 200 response code with Hola Joe and a timestamp of when it happened because of the moment library, just as we coded. So that is making a Lambda function in AWS. Thank you.